Jacob Whitman wasn't used to feeling small. He was the kind of man people listened to when he walked into a room, the type whose signature held weight, whose money moved projects, and whose gaze demanded attention. The world had always seemed bent slightly to accommodate his presence. From an elite East Coast education to building one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, Jacob believed there was a solution to everything. A price tag, a strategy, a process. There was always something that could fix it. But on a quiet Sunday evening inside a Los Angeles hospital, none of his money, power, or intelligence could fix what was currently breaking him apart. His newborn daughter wouldn't stop crying. She was barely 3 days old, his first child, a tiny bundle of skin in need, but her cries were not the soft, tired wailing of a baby needing a feed or a diaper change. They were sharp, constant, and filled the sterile hospital room like sirens. Piercing, gasping, heartbreaking. Jacob had driven back to the hospital that morning, his baby swaddled in the back seat, after an exhausting night that had left him shaking. His wife, Maya, had been home recovering from a minor surgery post-labor, so Jacob had insisted on handling their daughter for a night to give her space. He saw it as a simple task. After all, how hard could it be? But somewhere between 2 a.m. and 6, alone in their silent, luxury townhouse, Jacob panicked. He had tried everything: bottle feeding, walking back and forth through the hallways, Googling parenting hacks, even playing Mozart from his phone. Nothing worked. Her cries seemed to rise with every attempt. There was something primal in her sadness, something ancient and unreachable, and it terrified him. Now, back at the hospital, Jacob paced a maternity wing in designer shoes that echoed too loudly against the polished floors. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and he carried an air of discomfort that didn't go unnoticed by the nurses. "She's healthy," one young RN reassured. "Sometimes newborns cry inconsolably for hours. It's nothing you did wrong." Jacob nodded, but her words fell flat. He didn't know if it was guilt or shame nodding in his chest, or both. He looked at the tiny glass crib beside the hospital bed where his daughter still screamed. Her face was red, eyes squeezed shut, tiny fists clenched in distress. Everything in him wanted to run, to back away, to escape the feeling that he was failing something he should have instinctively known how to handle. This wasn't part of the plan. All his life, Jacob had stayed in control. But this felt like drowning in open air. And then she appeared. At first, he barely noticed her. Just a woman in a faded blue uniform, pushing a maintenance cart slowly down the hallway outside his room. She moved quietly, years of practice evident in each silent step. Her face was framed with soft graying curls, her hands worn from labor, and around her neck hung a small gold cross that shimmered subtly under the fluorescence. Her name tag read, Loretta M. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a doctor. She was a cleaner. One of those people who entered the room after the drama had cleared. The kind who often went unseen, even in places overflowing with emotion. Jacob hardly looked up. But then she stopped. She turned her head slightly toward the baby's crib, hearing the same endless cries that cracked the windows of Jacob's composure. Her brows furrowed, and for a moment she stood still, completely still, as though she had heard this exact sound before, just like this long ago. Then, with a gentle twinkle in her tired eyes, she knocked softly on the half-open door. "Sir," she said, voice low and respectful, "I couldn't help but overhear. Your daughter's got a strong cry." Jacob blinked, caught off guard. He nodded uncertainly, unsure how to respond. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his daughter, except Maya and the nurses, let alone a woman who wasn't part of the medical team. "I raised 6 of my own," she continued, offering a small, empathetic smile. "All grown now. I know what a baby's pain sounds like, and what comfort sounds like, too." Jacob let out a weary sigh, rubbing his temples. "Doctors say she's fine, but she just won't stop. I don't know what to do." Loretta took a step toward the crib, then paused. Her face softened even deeper, the creases around her mouth bending into compassion, not pity. "I know I'm not family or staff," she said carefully, "but if you'd be willing to let me try, sometimes these babies, they just need an old song or a different tone. Nothing scientific. Just something so deep. Jacob hesitated. His first instinct was to decline. Not out of malice, just confusion. How could a maid help where trained doctors couldn't? But in that moment, he realized something painful. No amount of pride was helping his child. So he nodded. "Please," he whispered. "Try." Loretta didn't rush. She moved slowly toward the crib, her steps quiet like a prayer. And then she lowered her arms, her hands slightly trembling, not from age but reverence, as if the tiny life she was about to touch deserved nothing less than grace. She picked the baby up with practiced ease, one hand under her head, another under her bottom, and swayed gently back and forth, back and forth. She began to hum, a low, ancient lullaby, one Jacob had never heard before. It didn't sound like anything from the apps or classical playlists. It was raw, haunting, almost spiritual, like it belonged in fields under moonlight or porches in summer air from generations long gone. The baby stopped crying. Instantly, the silence hit Jacob like a wave. His knees nearly buckled. His eyes widened with disbelief, watching as Loretta cradled his daughter close to her chest, whispering soft, unintelligible phrases that sounded like they came from a place of deep ancestral love. Jacob had never felt so humbled in his life. Tears filled his eyes, and for once, they weren't from frustration. They were from something else, something deeper, being witnessed, being helped, being saved by someone the world had taught him, directly or indirectly, to overlook. Loretta looked at him kindly. She just needed a little rhythm. Babies can feel energy. They know who's safe. Jacob didn't know what to say. Even thank you felt too small, too transactional for what had just happened. In that simple exchange, Loretta didn't just calm his daughter. She calmed him. Beneath the tension, beneath the stubborn shell of control and success, something inside Jacob cracked open. Not broken, but opened. Because for the first time, maybe ever, he realized there are some hearts you can't buy your way out of, some problems you can't reason through, and some healing only comes wrapped in soft hands, with lullabies sung by women who have weathered storms the world never names. And standing before him was one such woman, Loretta. She didn't demand gratitude. She didn't ask for recognition. She simply handed the baby back, now peaceful and asleep, and returned quietly to her cart, mop in hand, blending once again into the rhythm of the hospital halls. Jacob, still standing there in awe, vowed silently that he would never unsee her again. She left the room as quietly as she had entered. Loretta, with her worn uniform and well-worn wisdom, returning to the endless flow of mopping floors and arranging supplies. But her presence lingered, like the sweet scent of an old chapel long after the candles had been blown out. Jacob didn't move for several minutes. He stood by the hospital crib, motionless, while his baby, no longer crying, no longer restless, slept soundly for the first time since she was born. Every breath she took, soft and rhythmic, seemed like a miracle measured in seconds. His hands were still trembling, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, something deeper than surprise, closer to awe. That woman, she had walked into the room without fear or hesitation, looked him square in the eye, and calmed the storm that no expert could manage, all without expectation. No badge, no title, no degrees embroidered on her coat. Just presence, just experience. And something else, too, though Jacob couldn't name it yet. Looking down at his sleeping daughter, he felt it again, the sting of helplessness, but this time colored by humility. No amount of business deals, TED Talks, or investor meetings had ever made him feel this small and this grateful. He stepped out into the hallway, half expecting her to be gone, and she nearly was. He caught her just before she turned a corridor. She was pushing her cart with ease, humming a soft hymn under her breath, as if what had just happened inside that room was no more extraordinary than folding a sheet. "Excuse me," Jacob called, his voice shaky. Loretta turned. Her eyes were kind, but cautious, used to being called on, perhaps, but not for praise. He walked up slowly, unsure of how to begin. What do you say to someone who walks into your life and, in under 3 minutes, hands you more peace than you felt in days? I just want to say thank you," Jacob began. I don't know how you did that. She hasn't stopped crying since we brought her home. Nothing I did helped. Loretta nodded gently. You're welcome, Mr. Whitman. Jacob Whitman. She tilted her head slightly, clearly familiar with the name, likely from a hospital's donation plaques, or maybe the framed photo in the maternity wing. Technology grant funded by J. Whitman Holdings. He felt exposed all of a sudden. Well, Mr. Whitman, she said, some babies need more than comfort. Sometimes they're looking for something familiar that they don't even understand yet. He looked at her, confused. She's 3 days old. Doesn't matter, Loretta replied. They come into this world carrying pieces of where they came from. Memories, feelings, even rhythms. I just sang her something old. Something my grandmama used to sing to all of us back in Georgia. Jacob blinked. She responded to that. She felt it, she said softly. Same way you feel good in a room that smells like your mother's kitchen, even if she's been gone 20 years. Baby's got spirit sense. Before words and logic. He laughed under his breath. You're talking like a philosopher. Loretta chuckled. No, baby, I'm just old. Jacob wanted to say more, to ask what song it was, or more about her past. Something. But then a nurse walked by and slowed down long enough to throw a skeptical glance their way. Not at him. At Loretta. Nothing said. Just a look. Small but sharp. Jacob noticed. For the first time in his life, he noticed the nurse. She smiled politely at him, nodded stiffly at Loretta, then walked on. And in that instant, Jacob felt a discomfort creep into his spine, not because of anything Loretta did, but because he saw, at last, how invisible she had been made to feel. How many times had she helped someone else like this, and walked away unacknowledged? How many parents had she comforted? Rooms cleaned, silent contributions left to fade into the background like white noise. Suddenly, Jacob wasn't proud. He was ashamed, not just of the hospital system, or of that nurse's slight, but of himself. He thought back to board meetings where diversity was a bullet point more than a belief. He thought about his own assumptions made about people like Loretta, workers in uniforms, in aisles, in kitchens, people he barely looked at because they weren't in positions of power. He had spent his life defining worth by roles and resumes. But Loretta, with her brown hands and her southern lullabies, had just dissolved all of that in under 5 minutes. And she hadn't asked permission. She hadn't needed his approval. She had made space, in his world, in that sterile, high-priced room. And the baby had responded to it like a flower to sunlight. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Have you ever done that before? He asked, suddenly craving more of her story. Helped babies like that. Loretta smiled. Thousands of them. Some were drug babies, some colicky, some to scare this big OL world. I used to teach kindergarten. 23 years, till funding cutbacks and arthritis came. But this hospital lets me do the nighttime cleaning shift. Quiet, peaceful. I like being the last hand some people see before morning comes. Jacob felt something tugging at his chest. The contrast between their worlds had never been more clear. She had likely been working here when his company's name was etched onto those donor walls. And yet, he had never thought to know who guarded the halls at night, who watched the pain quietly clean. Why aren't you a nurse? He asked genuinely. She shrugged, her smile gentle but knowing. Nurses need money, degrees, credentials. I got caregiving in my bones, not on paper. That's never been enough in rooms that need proof. Jacob felt a bitterness rise in him, not toward her, but toward a world where people like Loretta went unseen, while people like him were celebrated for doing far less. She looked over his shoulder then, toward his baby's room. I'd be happy to stop by later again if you need her calm. No charge, she added, half teasing. Jacob smiled, but he also shook his head. No, I insist. Let me pay you somehow just for your time. But Loretta raised one hand and gently waved off, like the wind shooing away a fly. Not everything good has to be paid for, Mr. Whitman, she said, eyes twinkling. Some things are done out of love. Then, with the same humility she'd entered, she pushed her cart forward and disappeared down the corridor. Jacob stood frozen. Some things are done out of love. Her words echoed, not just in his ears, but in somewhere much deeper, maybe a part of him that had been long asleep. Until Loretta, until her voice, until that lullaby balanced the air in his world just enough to let his daughter breathe in peace. And for the first time in a while, Jacob Whitman, not the tech giant, not the philanthropist, not the power symbol, felt small in the most beautiful way. Not ashamed, not diminished, just human. He turned back toward the room, his daughter still sound asleep, and in the hush that followed, one truth settled fully into his chest. Kindness may not wear a white coat, but it wears wisdom, and sometimes takes a night shift. Jacob found himself returning to hospital every day, not just out of obligation for his daughter's temporary stay, but because something inside him was shifting, subtly like the seasons. He was no longer rushing in only to be updated by doctors or sign discharge papers. Now, he lingered in hallways. He watched. He listened. He paid attention. And in those quiet hours, in the background of beeping monitors and hushed conversations, he kept noticing her. Loretta, never in the limelight, never asking to be. She moved from room to room like candlelight, soft, unseen by most, yet warming everything in her presence. She cleaned around sleeping patients with a grace usually reserved for dancers, her mop gliding across hospital tiles with gentle control. Sometimes she hummed those haunting melodic lullabies. Sometimes she whispered prayers under her breath, almost inaudible, like secrets shared only with the walls. But Jacob noticed something else too, a pattern he hadn't wanted to see before, the way people treated her. He watched nurses ignore her when she gestured toward an overflowing trash bin. Doctors walked past her without nodding hello. One even asked her to get the door without so much as a thank you. She obeyed with a smile that Jacob now understood wasn't from joy, but from survival. From years of having to wear the face of calm in rooms that had always met her with caution, not curiosity. And yet, not once did she retaliate. She met every slight with patience, every cold stare with warmth, every dismissal with quiet resolve. Jacob began to wonder, where does a person find that amount of grace? And why should she even have to? That week, he brought her a cup of fresh coffee from a local cafe. It wasn't grand, not for a millionaire. But when he offered it, she stood still for a second, blinking at him as if he had handed her a medal. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Jacob replied. "But maybe someone should have a long time ago." She took the cup with both hands, quietly. "Well, thank you kindly." There was a pause between them, not awkward, but sacred. A pause where both understood it wasn't about coffee. It was about dignity, about being seen. Then Loretta surprised him. "Come walk with me," she said. Together, they moved through the hospital's long corridor. Jacob pushed the cart this time. It felt strange. His hands weren't built for carts or buckets, but something inside him wanted to feel the weight she carried each night. "Can I ask why cleaning? You said you were a teacher once," he asked gently. Loretta looked ahead as they walked. Her eyes didn't flinch, but her voice changed, calmer, almost reflective. "I taught in Alabama, back in the 70s and 80s. Kindergarten, mostly. I loved it. Those babies needed someone who looked at them and said, 'You matter. You are smart. You're more than what the world says.' I gave them that. Every day for 2 decades. Jacob nodded slowly, silently picturing her in front of a chalkboard, a room full of bright-eyed children before her. "What happened?" he asked. She tilted her head, almost like she was studying something only she could see. "Budget cuts," she said, "and something they called standardized testing. But if I'm honest, my skin got too loud in the wrong rooms. Suddenly, I wasn't teaching. I was being watched, judged. I stood up against a curriculum change once. Said it erased too much of our history. Called me difficult. Said I was emotional. But I've learned black women don't get to be emotional. We get called angry." Jacob swallowed hard. "Then my son, he was shot." Her voice wavered for the first time. Jacob froze. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He was 17, she continued, more to the wall than to him. "Walking home from school. Wrong time. Wrong place. Wrong color. That night, I didn't just lose him. I lost my breath. My strength. I left the classroom a month later. Couldn't teach kids anymore when mine was lying in a box. Jacob felt something wrench inside of him. The words felt too big to hold, and yet she carried them with sacred strength. I didn't have a backup plan. No retirement. Had to work. I saw this hospital was hiring. Cleaning. Night shifts. Less people to explain myself to. He looked at her, and for the first time, he truly saw the story beneath her skin. So you cleaned while you grieved. I cleaned to survive, she replied. But every now and then, someone like your baby would cry, and I'd remember my gift wasn't gone, just hidden under pain. They reached the end of the hallway. Loretta gently leaned against the cart. She wasn't trying to inspire. She wasn't giving a speech. She was simply telling the truth, and it broke Jacob open. How did you not grow bitter? He asked her. After everything. She looked at him and smiled. Bitterness is too heavy, she said. I already carry enough. My faith won't let me live angry. Her words landed slowly, like rain soaking soil that had been dry for too long. Jacob wanted to cry, not for her, because pity would dishonor her strength, but because of everything she had survived without losing her humanity. All at once, the balance of their worlds tilted completely. He had always judged value based on costs, contributions built on numbers and names. But Loretta had shown him that value could not be calculated. It had to be felt, heard, held in the weight of someone's experiences. She had survived racism, poverty, betrayal, and loss. Yet, she offered kindness like it cost her nothing. That night, Jacob sat in the hospital room, beside his daughter's crib. He watched her wriggle in her sleep, so small in a world so big. And for the first time since her birth, he wasn't thinking about business schedules or investments. He was thinking about the world she had entered. How unfair it could be, how cruel it often was to women like Loretta. And he made a silent oath that no chart, no clever company slogan, no Instagram video about diversity could ever reach where Loretta had reached in him. He had seen the truth now. The people who clean your mess may sometimes be the ones sent to heal your soul. He would never forget her. Not now. Not ever. Jacob sat still for a long time after Loretta walked away that evening. The plastic chair beneath him was stiff, yet he didn't move. Silence had coated the room like fog, broken only by the soft mechanical hum of machines and the gentle breathing of his daughter. She lay there, his daughter, just 3 days new to this complicated world. Eyes closed, hands curled into tiny fists, her chest slowly rising with the cadence of steady sleep. Peaceful, fragile, unaware of the weight surrounding her crib, or the quiet war unraveling inside her father's chest. Jacob had never considered himself a bad man. Maybe proud, maybe busy, but never cruel. He'd sponsored charities, led diversity training sessions at his firm, signed checks to build schools in communities he'd never visited. He thought that meant something. He thought it made him aware. But Loretta's story shattered that illusion, not violently, but with a kind of sacred grief that made him ache. He rubbed his hands together, remembering every board meeting where he'd sat at a long, polished table surrounded by people who looked only like him. Every tech convention filled with innovation talks that somehow always made inclusion feel like a footnote, a marketing strategy. He thought of the way Loretta had been spoken to by the nurse, like a function, not a human. And then he thought about the night his daughter cried uncontrollably, all the strategies he tried, all the things money couldn't touch, and how a woman the world passed over had calmed her not with tools or teachings, but with soul. It was humility, yes, but more than that, it was a kind of spiritual confrontation. He had to face the real, inescapable truth. He saw people like Loretta only when they served a purpose, when they fit into his well-structured frame. He had crafted a life that rewarded people like him for accomplishments. But Loretta, her power came from survival, compassion, memory, and she had never used that to hurt anyone. Instead, she came with peace. That truth was thunder, soft, but shaking everything. So he began to show up, not just physically, emotionally, soulfully. The next few days, Jacob returned to the hospital early, sometimes without his assistant, sometimes without his phone. He began holding his daughter differently, not just out of duty, but with growing reverence. Her cries slowly faded, replaced by moments of calm, gentle murmurs and stillness. He started humming, clumsily, the same tune he'd once heard Loretta sing, though it never sounded quite right. But maybe his daughter didn't need perfect notes. Maybe, just like her, he was a work in progress. He also looked for Loretta. Sometimes she wasn't easy to find. She moved like rhythm wrapped in shadows. But whenever she passed through the halls, her presence was noticed by him, now deeply, intentionally, and fully. One morning, Jacob brought her tea instead of coffee, remembering she had once said, "Coffee too late keeps my sugar running wild." She blinked when he offered it, and then smiled a slow, precious smile that crinkled her cheeks. "You listening now?" she said softly. "I'm trying," Jacob replied. They didn't talk deeply that day, but the silence was not awkward. It had shifted, becoming sacred. He was learning, finally, the honor of listening without interrupting, the respect born from presence instead of performance. But what truly transformed him was what happened on the fifth day. He arrived holding his daughter, who had been discharged but was scheduled for a follow-up. Loretta was mopping just inside the main lobby, her body moving methodically, her head softly swaying to him, playing beneath her breath. Jacob hesitated, then walked toward her. She looked up and smiled upon seeing the baby. "She looks calm," Loretta said. "She's different," Jacob replied. "Because of you." "No, baby," Loretta answered, eyes twinkling. "She's calm because you're different." That hit him harder than he expected. "Can I ask you something?" he said slowly, unsure if he had the right to ask, but feeling it rise from somewhere honest. If I've overlooked people like you before, what do I do with that?" Loretta leaned on her mop. She didn't rush to respond. That was her way. First, she said, "You don't pretend you didn't. That would be the easy way. You hold it. Let it burn a little. Ashes grow new things if you let them settle." Jacob nodded, heart clenching. "And second," she continued, "you open a door every time you enter a room. Not just for folks like you, but for folks don't expect to see there." He stood still, absorbing her words. "You mean like hiring differently?" "Listening. I mean, making sure that when someone like me sings a lullaby, the world don't turn the volume down just because it ain't in English or don't sound polished. I mean, elevating what don't shine in glass buildings." Jacob breathed deeply. He had been building ladders his whole life, but never wondered who was at the bottom, waiting as the elite climbed higher. Her words didn't make him feel guilty. They made him feel accountable. It was different, and that difference became Jacob's new compass. He started reading differently. He stopped signing things blindly, especially those diversity initiatives that centered only comfort instead of change. He asked harder questions. He started noticing who was invited to meetings and who cleaned up after them. He remembered Loretta's voice every time his daughter slept soundly against his chest. And strangely, the more he changed as a father. Because Loretta hadn't just soothed his baby. She had opened his heart. She made him question his version of good. She had shown him that kindness wasn't soft, wasn't passive. It was fierce. Fierce like a black woman who had lost a son to bullets, but still came back every night to sing peace to other people's children. Jacob knew now. He'd carry her with him forever, not as a lesson, but as a compass. She hadn't preached. She had showed. And that was louder than any boardroom speech. Some stories don't end. They echo. That's what Loretta had become in Jacob's life. An echo, not loud like applause, but quiet like a turning page. Something that stays with you even after the room grows quiet again. Weeks had passed since Jacob had taken his daughter home from the hospital. In those early days, he thought the biggest challenge of fatherhood would be long nights or messy routines. But it wasn't. The real challenge had been learning how to live differently, not just for his daughter, but for the world she was now a part of. Something was different in him now. He didn't move through the city like he used to. He had built his life walking confidently across polished floors, speaking in sharp sentences, always a man ahead of the game. But now his steps were slower. Less about being right, more about being present. He gave Loretta his personal number that last day at the hospital. "In case you ever need anything," he said. But she had only smiled and tucked the number into the front of her notebook like a bookmark, not making a big deal of it. She was never one for big deals. Since then, she hadn't called, but her presence followed him. At board meetings, he now asked new questions. Why were there no black women in management? Who cleaned these rooms every evening? And were their voices ever heard? At home, he sang small lullabies, nothing like Loretta's, but still, when the baby cried, she seemed to hear a rhythm in them, like she remembered. Like some soft part of her memory reached back to the hospital and recalled a warm voice, callous hands, and wisdom that walked with a mop. One evening, while watching his baby sleep in her crib under the glow of a small nightlight, Jacob opened his email and started writing something he hadn't planned. It was an address, not to investors, not to donors. It was a letter to his employees, his leadership team, and every contractor and cleaner who worked under his company's massive corporate umbrella. He told a story, honestly, about the night his daughter cried inconsolably, about how no nurse, no doctor, not even he, with all his wealth, could calm her, about one woman in a faded uniform who held her without fear and soothed her simply by being present. He wrote about the ordinary miracle that Loretta had become, but more importantly, he wrote about the change in him. He admitted how he lived seeing some people as background, how many Lorettas had moved past him in conference buildings and boardrooms and airports. Kind faces, wise eyes, who carried the world silently without being offered a seat at the table. He wrote the discomfort he'd felt, the shame he'd sat with, and the fire it had lit in his chest to do more than just feel moved. By the time he finished typing, an hour had passed. He hit send with trembling hands. What happened over the next few weeks couldn't have been predicted. The letter was shared, reshared, reposted. Messages came in from people across divisions, from janitors to executives. They'd all read it, not just as a man's confession, but as permission for their own reflection. Other CEOs emailed him privately, some thanking, some questioning, some confessing. But Jacob wasn't interested in just making waves. He wanted to make roots. The next month, he launched a foundation in his daughter's name, the Loretta Grace Initiative. Its mission was simple: to fund and uplift overlooked voices in low-wage industries, especially black women who had spent lifetimes serving without ever being seen. The first program offered scholarships for former caregivers and custodians to return to school if they wanted, to become teachers, counselors, nurses, or entrepreneurs. The second funded mental health services specifically for hospital cleaning staff and caregivers, those often treated like shadows in places filled with suffering. When Loretta was invited to speak at the first launch event, she wore her church best, a soft blue dress that matched her old uniform in color but not in message. Her hair was freshly curled, and her smile was as modest as ever. She stood before the crowd, not to impress, but to bear witness. "I came into that hospital room not to shine," she said at the podium, voice steady, "but because a cry called me. Sometimes God puts you in a place to give what only you can give. So I gave a song. That's all it was. But we know it wasn't just a song. It was salvation." After the event, Jacob stood with Loretta under the soft lights near the exit doors. His daughter, now nearly 3 months old, lay asleep in his arms just as she had in Loretta's. "She remembers you," Jacob said softly. Loretta smiled, brushing her fingers gently over the baby's cheek. "She remembers love. That's what we leave behind. Sweetheart, just love." "You changed me," Jacob whispered. "One moment, and my whole life shifted." "No," she replied, her voice barely above a breath. "You were ready to be changed. That's the difference." That night, Jacob didn't return home feeling powerful. He returned feeling entrusted. He now understood the real work of love wasn't flashy. It wasn't on panels or podcasts. It was in quiet rooms, in tired hands and soft lullabies, in the patience to show up for people even after the world never showed up for you. Loretta had done that, not with speeches, not with wealth, but with presence and kindness, and it spread like light through cracks. Weeks later, Jacob included Loretta's Lullaby, beautifully reimagined by a string quartet, as the closing track in the background is TED Talk titled, Who We Listen to Changes Us. It wasn't a speech about business. Instead, it was about grace. Soft, slow-growing grace. The world needed more of that. And when people asked what legacy he hoped his daughter would inherit, he no longer said enterprise or access. Now he said, I want her to become someone who sees people, truly sees them, the way someone once saw me, even when I didn't deserve it. Because one desperate night, the sound of a baby's cry became the quiet beginning of a new world, not through invention, but through presence, through kindness, through Loretta, and her song still plays, not just in hospital rooms, but in every heart learning to listen for the very first time.